Hi, fifth graders. Yesterday, you began a picture walk looking at some images of slavery from West Africa coming to the Americas. Now, we're going to dive deeper into understanding the history of slavery in America. Our story begins here in West Africa. West Africa is a region of Africa that lies near the equator and south of the Sahara, a large desert in northern Africa. To its west and south is the Atlantic Ocean. Most of West Africa is covered by grassland or rainforest. Now, in the 1500s, people of many cultures lived in West Africa. In many ways, West Africa, in many ways, West Africans were alike. Most people farmed. Some were miners, craftspeople, or traders. Traders led caravans of camels carrying gold and ivory from West Africa to countries north of the Sahara. In return, West Africans received salt, cloth, and other goods. Here, I can see a daily life in West Africa. Throughout West Africa, society was based on the family. Relatives lived in the same village. They owned land together and shared their crops. They also worshiped the spirits of their ancestors. Villagers danced and sang chants to ask the spirits to protect them. Another one of the common traditions was storytelling. Fables, legends, and myths helped these people learn about their culture and history. But West Africans were different in many other ways too. Some people lived in small villages, while others lived in large cities, such as Timbuktu. Some villagers and cities were part of empires. The people of West Africa spoke many languages. Often, people from different villages could not understand one another. Most West Africans in the 1500s lived in freedom, but that would change when slave traders from Europe came to Africa. When I'm looking at this picture, I'm wondering who are the slave traders and who might be getting taken into slavery. I can kind of notice this fear and worry by the West Africans sitting in this long canoe. Some people in West Africa were not free. These enslaved people were servants or workers. Some of them had been captured during wars or had been found guilty of crimes. West Africans sometimes sold these slaves to Arab traders. These traders were from countries in North Africa and Southwest Asia. Although these slaves were not free, many of them were a part of the larger family in a village. They may have had fewer rights than other villagers, but they could own their own land to farm. They could become skilled workers and earn money. Often their descendants would be considered free. Traders from Europe changed this way of life in West Africa. Europeans had sugar and tobacco plantations in the Americas that needed workers. Using slaves was a cheap way to get the work done. So traders went to West Africa. They offered cloth, rum, salt, and other goods in exchange for slaves. Many Africans became wealthy by trading slaves for goods like these. The European traders also offered to trade guns for slaves. A village that had guns became more powerful than its neighbors. Once one village decided to make this trade, then it forced its neighbors to protect themselves by trading slaves for guns too. Soon, groups all over West Africa were capturing and enslaving people to trade them for guns. Here we can see slaves being chained, walking somewhere. A few West Africans refused to take part in the slave trade, but it was hard to resist the Europeans. One West African king tried. He said that he would not permit slaves to be moved throughout his country. The Europeans tried to bribe him, but still the king refused. Then the Europeans convinced a rival group of West Africans to go to war against him. Many of the king's people were captured and then sold as slaves themselves. Other West Africans tried to find slaves outside their own nations. Sometimes a king made war against its neighbors, and he sold the people that he captured to the slave traders. More often, however, a group from one West African village would raid another village. Armed with guns, the raiders would capture men, women, and children. Sometimes they would kidnap the children while the adults were out farming in the fields. Some West African groups did not raid other villages. Instead, they traded people who were already their slaves, such as prisoners they had captured during previous wars. These groups did not want to be a part of the slave trade, but they had little choice. Their neighbors who did trade slaves were becoming richer and more powerful and might soon try to capture and sell them as slaves. This image always kind of gives me chills. It looks like a diagram of a ship, and in it, I see lots of bodies lying next to each other. Even down here, lots and lots of rows of slaves. The slaves faced a terrible journey. First, other West Africans put them in chains and then marched them hundreds of miles to West Africa's coast. Many slaves died along the way or after reaching the coast. Then European traders loaded the survivors onto slave ships for the voyage to the Americas. This voyage was called the Middle Passage because it was the second of 3 stages of the slave trade. The Middle Passage took from 21 to 90 days. In bad weather, it could take even longer. Traders sold slaves in South America, the West Indies, and the British colonies. For the slaves, the trip was a nightmare. They were allowed little exercise. Pairs of men were chained together at their ankles and wrists without room to sit up or to stand. Often, men, women, and children were packed so closely together that they could barely move. Many were covered with sores from lying on the rough floorboards. The smell and the heat were unbearable, and the ships were full of lice, fleas, and rats. Sharks followed the ships, feeding on the dead who were thrown overboard. No one knows how many West Africans made the Middle Passage, but the number has been estimated to be at 10 to 12 million. About 15 of every 100 Africans died during this voyage. Here I can see a map, and what I'm noticing is arrows moving out and arrows coming back in. It looks like between Africa, the Americas, and England, we are trading goods with our slaves. And so what we had just read was the Middle Passage. Now that is following this green arrow from West Africa to the West Indies. Our slaves are a part of this trade route. The slave trade was a part of triangular trade. European traders took slaves from Africa to the Americas and sold them to owners of sugar plantations in the West Indies and tobacco plantations in the southern colonies. In the West Indies, slaves grew sugarcane. It was turned into sugar and molasses. New Englanders bought these products and made them into rum. Traders took American goods such as rum, tobacco, and lumber to Europe. Then they took goods made in Europe to Africa. There, they traded the goods for more slaves.